in the early 80s, you had green screens, right? Terminals. Microsoft either launched or copied, depending on your perspective, the graphical user interface in the late mid-'80s, and there were a lot of enterprise apps that were starting to get built on that. In about the mid-'90s, you had enterprise software companies like EcoSystems and PeopleSoft look around and say, wait, there might be something to this web world, so let's go ahead and build web or browser-based interfaces on top of our client-server systems. And then following that, in the early 2000s, you really had Salesforce, NetSuite, and other business software companies start to pave the way for true cloud-based enterprise software. And this is when APIs. It's fascinating to me that we're at API conferences now, and I remember Larry Ellison talking about, if you remember, network computers and things like that back in the early 2000s, probably a little bit ahead of his time. And now, in the late 2000s, we have kind of newer software as a service vendors starting to expose APIs. And so this is what the enterprise software world that we've been living in looks like. And if you look at what's happened on the consumer side across the same time frame, it's very interesting, right? So the first millennials were born in the early 80s, and they grew up with PCs in the house, right? It was the norm. They had personal cellular phones, or their parents did. They were introduced to this concept of the internet subscription. Eventually they had laptops and netbooks. The games that they played were all on connected devices. They were introduced to social networks. You had these fantastic new phones that came out, and eventually tablets at really fast speeds. And over the same period of time, this group of millennials grew up, and they're starting to enter the workforce in fairly big numbers now. Over 50% of the workforce in a couple of years will be millennials. And they enter the workforce, and they're using the software either as a consumer or as an employee. And there's a huge, what we call an engagement gap, right? And this is, emphasized by a variety of different things, but we're starting to see companies now think about how do they take these consumer-oriented concepts like gamification or mobile-first or push-based information and embed it in their enterprise software. And that's one of the things that we do at AnyPresence, is help them kind of move into this modern world that many of you guys kind of take for granted now, and take the best practices that you have and embed them in the enterprise. And what's also very interesting is, back in the PC days, when they were in their client-server systems, there wasn't a whole lot of need to abstract APIs. They learned their lessons transitioning to the web, and now we're in the kind of the post-PC era where they feel the pain even more acutely, right? You have a plethora of these different mobile devices, and we're on the precipice of, for lack of a better term, this Internet of Things explosion, right? And so businesses today that are just getting ready for this post-PC era see this tsunami coming, and they very quickly realize that the most successful organizations are going to be the ones that have the best developer ecosystems. And that could be an external developer ecosystem, or it could be an internal developer ecosystem, people within the organization that are trying to build apps for these various devices now and in the future. Okay? So what are some of the challenges that the clients face? Well, if you've worked in the enterprise, like I have, and have felt the pain of this, enterprise development cycles were typically fairly long, right? 12, 18 months were not uncommon for an application. Those are significantly reducing to even much less than 6 to 8 months. Max showed within 10 minutes how you can build a very quick web-based mobile app. And so the development cycles are changing. The budgets are not changing to match those development cycles. Right? There's a lot more complexity across front ends, back ends, integration to these legacy systems, and Morgan mentioned the development cycle is now happening at a much more rapid pace. So rapid iterations of prototyping and updates, and all of this is leading to pain in the enterprise. One of the things that we've learned by working with companies is having API endpoints is a great start, but it's not the end result, right? It's actually the first step in a journey. Morgan briefly described some of the benefits of a back-end server. If you layer a back-end server on top of your APIs, either to make them more mobile optimized or create an abstraction layer that then enables you to generate software development kits that handle things like offline caching, familiar syntax, so you don't have to interpret the API for the particular platform you're building on. And ideally, on top of the SDK, you also provide a starting point, a functional user interface that customers can use or developers can use. You've significantly lowered the hurdle right? Reduce the time it takes to have developers adopt that API. And so what we're starting to see now are, companies that initially adopted APIs and exposed these to the developer ecosystems, they're all quickly hitting parity or for lack of a better term, commoditization, right? So if you look at a payment company like American Express or Visa, they all have the same APIs pretty much, and the documentation is fairly similar. So companies now that are more effectively able to provide to their developers custom specific versions of a backend server, an SDK, and starter user interface kits will really be the ones who are competitive in this new kind of world of building out and getting adoption within developer ecosystems. Okay, so what's emerging is a fairly, I think, standard now 3-tier architecture as a best practice, where at the front end layer, you kind of separate the presentation from the data management aspect. So you've got your user interface, and that user interface is bound typically through what we're calling a software development kit or a data management layer. So that you've got offline caching and token management and all those things. And that SDK layer then hits this mobile or application services layer, which has a variety of other capabilities. When you're mobile enabling legacy systems, for example, you're probably not going to have things like push notifications or SMS messaging or even mobile app specific business logic and user roles. And so having this middle tier layer allows you to do a lot of abstraction and add value to serve the needs of the mobile apps you're trying to build. Right, and ultimately, of course, these mobile services are then bound to the ugly, legacy systems, the boring stuff that you've had to deal with if you're an enterprise developer. So this is kind of, an emerging architecture that we're starting to see that's getting a lot of traction. This is what a potential example of that architecture could look like, right? So you have a back-end service that is perhaps, either multi-tenant or dedicated per app that you're building. And that back-end service provides a variety of services like authorization and access control, data storage connectors. If you're running this back-end service in the cloud, you may have some sort of an on-premise agent behind the firewall that's hitting, corporate sensitive data. And then, of course, you may have other third-party extensions or services that you've plugged into this middle tier. And on the front end, you'll have these SDKs that encapsulate all of the APIs on this backend server and provide additional services on the device, a little bit of client-side logic and caching and things like that. And then on top of the SDKs, you have your user interface. And then, of course, you'll from an enterprise perspective, need to deploy this server in development, test, production instances, things like that. And on the front end, in the enterprise, you're not always necessarily pushing the app to an application store like Google or Apple. In some cases, you may be pushing apps directly to employee devices through technology called mobile device management or mobile application management. Right, so this is emerging as again, an example of that 3-tier architecture that we showed earlier. Okay. So what might this look like if you're enabling a developer ecosystem? So the first step, of course, is get your APIs in order, and all the best practices that entails in terms of testing it, making sure you have sample data and things like that. Once you've done that, one of the things you could do, and that we're working with some of our customers to do, is you define a template app, right, a starting point for how that API could potentially be used. And there could be different templates for different industries or different scenarios, but you define those templates that are integrated with your services, and you determine which features or aspects of that template can be customized. You then take your existing developer portal that you might have, or you build a new one, and you expose these templates to the developers, allow them to select the template, specify the options, and the output of that will be a customized version of a kind of a lightweight backend server, the SDKs, the user interface, perhaps some documentation and things, that instead of giving generic APIs or documents to the developer, gives them a fully functioning starter app. Right? So they can instantly play around with the app, run it in Xcode or Android Development Toolkit or what have you, and see how the APIs are being used. Either take that app and customize it to meet their needs, or use it as a starting point to figure out how they need to effectively consume your SDKs and your APIs. Okay. So I took a few screenshots of an example of what this might look like. So imagine that you are a pharmaceutical company and you manufacture drugs, or you've got a lot of data on drug information. So your developer portal could look like a list of all the APIs and documentation, or you could take more of a scenario-based approach where when the developer logs in, they have a list of all the apps they've built, and they can click New App. And once they click New App, they're presented with a series of templates. And these templates essentially encapsulate the APIs that you provide, right? So one of the APIs could be looking up drug interactions. Another could be finding a pharmacy to purchase the drug. A third might be finding a physician who happens to know what that drug will do for you, or side effects, things like that. Once you select the app, you go ahead and specify options. And these could be the platforms you want to run this on, some extensions perhaps, upload your logo. And behind the scenes, instead of, again, getting a standard API and documentation, what you get is actually a fully functioning app with all the source code potentially pushed to GitHub so the developer can put their credentials in that you can download and be running, right? So instead of taking a few days or weeks potentially to build an app that consumes your APIs, within a few minutes you've given the developer a fully functioning app, and they're off and running, right? So, the overall kind of lesson learned here is API management is the starting point, not the ending point of where you need to be. And API management vendors or organic API management systems you build will have things like usage and bandwidth throttling, key management, perhaps some governance and policy management, maybe monetization if you're planning to monetize it. With that, you can add value-added backend services that essentially abstract these APIs, generate cross-platform software development kits, put in any mobile-specific business logic and services, and then ideally, on top of that, you also provide a starting point for the user interface. So an example iOS or Android or HTML5-based app that consumes those SDKs. And all of this will yield a hopefully happy developer ecosystem, both now and in the future. Okay? And that's it.